We had to freeze your accounts, Eleanor. It is for your own safety, sweetheart. The doctors agree that your episodes are becoming too frequent. My older brother Derek adjusted his custom-tailored Italian silk tie. He sat across from me in my own dining room, wearing the condescending, sympathetic smile he had perfected over 3 decades. Next to him sat his wife Megan, her meticulously manicured hand resting gently on his arm. She was wearing a pearl necklace she had borrowed from my late mother's jewelry box and never returned. Across from them sat Craig Bellamy, a high-powered corporate attorney who looked like a man entirely too comfortable destroying lives before breakfast. I looked at Derek, then I looked at Megan, finally I looked down at the cup of Earled tea resting between my hands. The steam curled upward in the morning light, a silent, fragile ghost in a room heavy with betrayal. I did not scream, I did not cry, I did not throw the antique porcelain cup against the wall, though I could see the anticipation of such an outburst glimmering in Megan's carefully shaded eyes. "You missed one, Derek," I said softly, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of noise. It was a dense, suffocating vacuum. Derek's hand froze mid-air, the condescending smile fractured, splintering like thin ice under sudden unbearable weight. What happened over the next 14 days would cost my brother his reputation, his entire corporate empire, and every delusion of superiority he had ever harbored. But to understand the devastating perfection of that collapse, you have to understand who I really am, and the fatal mistake they made by assuming I was nothing more than the family scapegoat. Welcome back to Alpha M Stories. If you have ever been underestimated, gaslit, or told that your silence was a sign of weakness, drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from. This is a story about the danger of waking a sleeping dragon. Make sure you subscribe because the revenge you are about to hear is going to satisfy every unspoken grievance you have ever held. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 32 years old to my brother and his social climbing wife. I was just little Ellie, the quiet, unassertive younger sister who worked a tedious, low-paying bookkeeping job somewhere in the sprawling gray suburbs of Virginia. They thought I spent my days balancing ledgers for mom-and-pop hardware stores and my evenings knitting in my modest, two-bedroom cottage. They thought I was fragile, they thought I was naive. They had absolutely no idea that I am a senior forensic auditor for a specialized federal intelligence task force. My actual job does not involve balancing petty cash. My job involves tracing invisible money across international borders. I dismantle multi-million-dollar shell corporations, untangle offshore tax evasion schemes, and hunt down white-collar criminals who think they are too rich and too smart to be caught. I track digital footprints through the dark web. I analyze financial discrepancies that even Wall Street algorithms miss. I have sat in sterile interrogation rooms and watched billionaire hedge fund managers weep into their expensive suits when I placed a single manila folder on the table. In my world, patience is not a virtue, it is a lethal weapon. You do not react, you observe, you document, you let the target weave their own web, confident in their brilliance, until they have provided every single thread needed to hang themselves. Derek was 48 years my senior, and he had spent his entire life bathing in the golden glow of our parents' expectations. He was the handsome, charismatic son, the one destined for greatness. He went to the Ivy League business school, he married the beauty queen, he launched a high-end commercial real estate development firm, building sleek glass and steel monoliths that scraped the sky in downtown Boston. When our parents died in a tragic aviation accident 6 years ago, they left behind a modest estate. Or so Derek thought. They left the family home to him, assuming he would need it for his growing family. To me, they left a seemingly ordinary trust fund and the small cottage I currently lived in. Derek had scoffed at my inheritance, generously offering to manage it for me since, in his words, I had never been very good with complex adult responsibilities. I declined his offer. I told him I had a quiet little job and I would manage just fine. What he did not know, what no one in the family knew, was that our parents' modest trust fund had contained a small portfolio of incredibly early-stage tech investments. Over the past decade, while Derek was taking out massive loans to fund his flashy real estate projects, I had taken those investments and aggressively, silently multiplied them. By the time I was 30, I had accumulated a net worth of over $600 million. My assets were dispersed across a labyrinth of impenetrable trusts managed by a private syndicate in Geneva. My wealth was invisible, untraceable to anyone who did not possess the exact cryptographic keys. I drove a reliable 5-year-old sedan, I wore unbranded, high-quality clothing, I lived an absolute far removed from the exhausting performative circus of my brother's socialite existence. But Derek's world was built on sand. For years I had watched him from the periphery. I saw the leased luxury cars, the extravagant vacations to Saint-Tropez that were suspiciously timed around the end of fiscal quarters, the desperate hollow glint in Megan's eyes whenever someone else wore a larger diamond. They were drowning in the illusion of wealth, treading water in a sea of toxic debt. The first red flag appeared at our family's annual Thanksgiving dinner. Derek and Megan always hosted the event at their sprawling 7-bedroom mansion, a property that, as my trained eye had immediately recognized years ago, was heavily leveraged with multiple secondary mortgages. "Ellie, darling," Megan had purred, pouring me a glass of generic supermarket wine while she and Derek drank a vintage Bordeaux. "How is the little accounting gig? Still crunching those numbers for the local bakery?" "It pays the bills, Megan," I replied evenly, offering a mild, unremarkable smile. Derek laughed loudly, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. "You know, if you ever need a real job, my CFO could always use a junior assistant. Someone to file the receipts. It would be good for you to get out of that dusty little cottage." "You've been so withdrawn lately." "I like my cottage," I said softly. "Of course you do." Megan chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It's safe, though I do worry about you living out there all alone. You forgot my birthday last month, Ellie, and at brunch 2 weeks ago you kept repeating the same story about Mom's old recipes. Are you getting enough sleep?" "You seem so scattered." I had not forgotten her birthday. I had intentionally ignored it because the previous year she had returned the gift I bought her and used the store credit to buy herself a designer dog collar. And I had not repeated any stories at brunch. She had simply spoken over me so many times I had been forced to start my sentence twice. But I did not argue. I simply shook a quiet, placid expression. "I'm perfectly fine." "Megan, just a little tired perhaps." That was when the seed was planted. I recognized the tactic instantly. In forensic auditing, we call it narrative construction. When a fraudster is preparing to execute a scheme, they must first establish a plausible baseline reality. They need a cover story. Megan and Derek were beginning to lay the groundwork for a very specific narrative. Eleanor is unstable. Eleanor is declining. Eleanor needs help. Over the next 6 months, the microaggressions escalated into a synchronized, deliberate campaign of psychological sabotage. It was masterfully subtle, the kind of gaslighting that leaves no bruises but fractures the mind. In January, Megan visited my cottage unannounced, claiming she was just checking in. She brought a casserole, stayed for 20 minutes, and complained about her personal trainer. After she left, I went into the kitchen to wash my tea mug and immediately smelled gas. The third burner on my stove had been turned on, not ignited, just the gas silently leaking into the room. If I had been an ordinary person, I might have doubted myself. I might have thought, did I bump the knob? Am I becoming forgetful? But I am not an ordinary person. I am a woman who trusts data, not feelings. 2 days after the stove incident, I quietly installed a network of high-definition micro-surveillance cameras throughout my cottage. They were military-grade, smaller than a dime, hidden inside the smoke detectors, the spine of a hardcover book, and the decorative trim of the kitchen cabinets. Every frame of footage was automatically encrypted and backed up to a secure offshore server. In March, Derek invited me to a lavish charity gala he was sponsoring. I attended wearing a simple black dress. Halfway through the evening, I went to the restroom. When I returned, my purse had been moved to a different table and my phone was missing. I found it 30 minutes later, submerged in a decorative water fountain in the lobby. "Oh, Ellie," Derek sighed heavily when the security guard handed me the dripping device. He looked at the surrounding guests with an expression of profound, tragic embarrassment. "Again? You really need to be more careful. You've been so erratic lately." I looked at my ruined phone. I looked at Derek's perfectly styled hair. "Yes," I said quietly. How clumsy of me. What Derek did not know was that my phone was a specialized encrypted device. The moment it hit the water and lost connection to its biometric pairing, it automatically wiped its internal drive and sent an alert to my private security protocol. More importantly, the micro camera embedded in my purse's clasp had recorded Megan slipping my phone into her clutch while I was in the restroom. They were building a case for incompetence, a case for a conservatorship. The true motive remained hidden until a rainy Tuesday in April. My niece Rosie, Derek and Megan's 19-year-old daughter showed up at my door in tears. Rosie was the only redeeming quality of Derek's household. She was sharp, observant, and deeply uncomfortable with her parents' superficial lifestyle. She was studying cybersecurity at MIT, a path her parents loudly disapproved of because it wasn't a suitable degree for a society wife. We shared a quiet bond, a mutual understanding of what it meant to be the outlier in a family of narcissists. "Aunt Ellie," she whispered, stepping out of the rain and into my hallway. She was shaking. "I need to tell you something. I think Dad is in serious trouble, and I think they are coming after you." I led her into the kitchen, wrapped a warm blanket around her shoulders, and poured her a cup of chamomile tea. I did not rush her, my posture perfectly still, radiating the calm, unshakable energy of a woman who makes her living navigating chaos. "Tell me exactly what you heard, Rosie, word for word. Do not leave anything out." She took a trembling breath. "I was home for the weekend last night. Dad had Craig Bellamy over. They were in the study. They thought I was asleep, but I went downstairs to get water. They were drinking heavily. Dad was pacing. He sounded terrified. He kept saying, 'The bridge loan is due in 2 weeks. Craig, the Japanese investors pulled out. If we don't cover the 2.5 million shortfall, the entire Atlantic Plaza development defaults. First Capital will seize everything, the house, the cars, everything.'" I absorbed the information without a flicker of emotion. $2.5 million, a rounding error in my world, but an insurmountable abyss for a man drowning in debt. "What did Craig say?" I asked, my voice smooth as glass. "Craig told him to calm down," Rosie continued, her hands tightly gripping the mug. "He said, 'We execute the contingency plan, the paperwork is ready, your sister's checking and savings accounts won't cover it, but the property will. We use the emergency medical power of attorney. We declare her a danger to herself, unfit to manage her assets. We transfer the deed of her cottage into the family trust, leverage it as collateral, and secure the gap funding. We'll drain her liquid accounts for the legal fees.'" "And your mother?" I asked. "Mom was there too." Rosie choked back a sob. She said, "It's perfectly believable. She left the stove on, she ruined her phone at the gala, she's isolated, single and deteriorating. The judge will sign the emergency order in 24 hours. We are doing her a favor, she belongs in an assisted living facility anyway." I sat there in the quiet kitchen. The only sound was the steady drumming of the rain against the window pane. I felt a cold, pristine clarity wash over my mind. It was the same feeling I got when I finally cracked the encrypted ledger of a cartel money launderer. The puzzle was complete, the picture was perfect. My brother was not just arrogant, he was a predator. He was willing to strip away my autonomy, my home, and my dignity, to lock me away into facility just to cover his own catastrophic financial failures. "Aunt Ellie," Rosie whispered by my puzzle. "What are you going to do? They are filing the papers on Friday. You need to run, you need to hide your money." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. My skin was warm, my pulse slow and steady. "Rosie," I said, a slow predatory smile touching the corners of my mouth, "I am not going to run and I am certainly not going to hide, but Dad and Craig, they have lawyers. They have judges in their pocket. They are going to crush you." "Your father," I replied softly, "is playing checkers in the dark. I am playing three-dimensional chess with satellite imagery. You did the right thing by coming to me. Now I need you to go back home, pretend you heard nothing, and watch the show. Do not interfere, do not warn them, just watch." When Rosie left, I did not cry, I did not panic. I walked into my home office, locked the reinforced steel door, and booted up my encrypted workstation. The monitors flared to life, casting a cold blue glow across the room. I opened a secure, untraceable terminal connection. It was time to go to work. If Derek wanted to play forensic auditor with my life, I was going to show him how a professional dismantles an empire. I spent the next 48 hours in absolute uninterrupted focus. I did not sleep, I drank black coffee and let the numbers tell me their secrets. Using my clearance and my proprietary algorithms, I bypassed the commercial firewalls of Derek's real estate firm, Saunders Development. I didn't hack them, I simply pulled the publicly available tax records, the anonymized banking transactions, and the municipal permits, cross-referencing them through a data mining matrix I had personally designed. What I found was far worse than a simple bridge loan default. Derek and Craig Bellamy were not just failing businessmen. They were running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. They were taking deposits from new investors on future, unbuilt projects and using those funds to pay off the interest on their failing older properties. They were deeply intertwined with a network of shady offshore shell companies, inflating property valuations to secure fraudulent loans from regional banks. The $2.5 million they needed wasn't just to save a building. It was the absolute minimum required to prevent a cascading default that would expose the entire criminal enterprise to federal investigators. They were desperate, cornered animals, and they thought I was a wounded rabbit they could easily devour. I began compiling the dossier, downloaded the ledgers, I traced the fraudulent wire transfers, I mapped the shell companies, I documented every forged signature, every inflated appraisal, every illegal diversion of funds. I cross-referenced Craig Bellamy's legal filings, finding a pattern of predatory conservatorships he had orchestrated against elderly and vulnerable individuals over the past decade. He had a playbook and Derek was using it against his own sister. By Thursday morning, the dossier was complete. It was a digital masterpiece of financial destruction, 54 pages of irrefutable federal-level evidence. It was enough to put both of them in federal prison for 20 years. But I was not done. Destroying their business was not enough. I needed to destroy the narrative they had built about me. I needed to sever the trap they thought they had so cleverly set. I picked up my encrypted phone and made a single unrecorded call to Dr. Eris Thorne. Dr. Thorne was not a local therapist, he was the chief of psychiatry at a premier federal medical facility. The man who evaluated covert operatives before they were deployed into hostile territories. He owed me a favor for quietly resolving a very messy, highly classified financial blackmail situation involving his ex-wife 5 years ago. Eleanor, his voice was crisp through the encrypted line. To what do I owe the pleasure? Eris, I said, leaning back in my ergonomic chair. I need a full, comprehensive psychological and cognitive evaluation. Immediately, I need it stamped, notarized, and legally bulletproof against any state-level judicial inquiry. And I need a secondary toxicology screening proving my system is completely clear of any psychotropic substances. Are you being deployed? He asked, sensing the urgency. No, I replied smoothly. My family is trying to declare me mentally incompetent to seize my assets. There was a brief pause followed by a low, genuine chuckle. Your family? Good God, do they have any idea who you are? Not a clue, and I want to keep it that way until the absolute last second. Be at my private clinic in 2 hours, he said. I will bring in an independent court-certified adjudicator to co-sign the evaluation. By the time we are done, you will have documentation proving you are the most sane, hyper-competent individual on the Eastern Seaboard. Thank you, Eris. I spent the afternoon at his clinic. I completed the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the MMPI-2, and a grueling 3-hour psychiatric interview with the independent adjudicator. I scored perfectly. My cognitive function was in the top 0.1% of the population. The toxicology report came back flawlessly clean. By 5 o'clock, I held a thick, heavily stamped medical binder that essentially served as a legal shield made of titanium. Friday arrived, the day of the execution. I woke up at 6, did an hour of Pilates, and made a pot of Earl Grey tea. I dressed in a pair of comfortable cashmere lounge pants and an oversized sweater. I wanted to look exactly the way they expected me to look, domestic, soft, and utterly unprepared. At exactly 9:15 a.m. my phone buzzed, a notification from my secondary visible bank account, the decoy account I used for daily expenses, which held a paltry $22,000. Outgoing transfers restricted, account frozen by external legal mandate. I smiled. A genuine bright smile. They had done it. They had actually pulled the trigger. 10 minutes later, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed through my front hallway. I walked to the door, adopting a slightly confused, timid expression, and opened it. There stood Derek, wearing a bespoke navy suit, looking grave and deeply concerned. Next to him was Megan, clutching a designer handbag, her face twisted into a mask of theatrical sorrow. And behind them, holding a sleek black briefcase, was Craig Bellamy. I asked, my voice slightly higher, softer than usual. What are you doing here so early? Is everything okay? Derek sighed, running a hand through his hair. Ellie, sweetheart, can we come in? We need to talk, it's important. I stepped aside, playing the obedient, clueless sister. Of course, I just made tea, would you like some? We moved to the dining room. They sat down, a united front of predatory concern. I sat across from them, bringing my cup of tea with me. Ellie, Derek began, his voice dripping with artificial empathy. We love you, you know that, right? Mom and Dad asked me to look out for you, and I take that responsibility very seriously. I know, Derek, I whispered, looking down at the table. You haven't been yourself lately, Megan interjected, reaching out to gently touch my hand. I suppressed the urge to break her wrist, the confusion, the forgetfulness, the stove incident. You ruined your phone at the gala. We've been so worried that you might accidentally hurt yourself. Or be taken advantage of. Craig Bellamy opened his briefcase. The metallic click of the latches sounded loud in the quiet room. He pulled out a stack of dense legal documents stamped with the seal of the state court. Eleanor, Craig said, using his deep, authoritative courtroom voice. My name is Craig Bellamy. I represent your brother due to the rapid decline in your cognitive stability. Derek has filed an emergency petition for temporary conservatorship. The judge reviewed the affidavits detailing your recent behavior and granted the order this morning. I widened my eyes, letting a look of perfect orchestrated panic wash over my face. Conservatorship, what does that mean? It means, Derek said gently, that for your own protection we had to freeze your accounts. Eleanor, it is for your own safety, sweetheart. The doctors agree that your episodes are becoming too frequent. I will be taking over the management of your finances and the deed to this cottage just until you get better. We are going to find you a nice, safe place where professionals can take care of you. They were waiting for the breakdown. They were waiting for me to cry, to beg, to scream that I was fine. That was the reaction they needed to validate their narrative. Hysteria is the best evidence of instability. I looked at Derek, then I looked at Megan. I looked down at my tea, the steam rising, a ghost in the room. And then the timid, frightened younger sister vanished. The posture I had held for 30 years, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes downcast, evaporated. I straightened my spine, leaning back in my chair with the relaxed, terrifying grace of an apex predator that has just locked the cage from the inside. The air in the room seemed to suddenly drop 10 degrees. You missed one, Derek, I said softly, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. My voice was no longer soft, it was cold, flat, and resonant with absolute authority. Derek blinked, disoriented by the sudden radical shift in my demeanor. What? I said. You missed one, the asset search to freeze my accounts this morning. You missed one. Craig frowned, glancing down at his paperwork. We secured the primary checking and savings at First National. The order covers all domestic financial institutions. Yes, I agreed, setting the teacup down. The clink of porcelain against the wood sounded like a gunshot. You secured $22,000, a tragic sum, but you missed the primary portfolio. The offshore trust syndicate in Geneva, the one currently holding $614 million in diversified assets. Megan let out a sharp, involuntary laugh. 600, Ellie, you are delusional. This is exactly why we are doing this. I reached under the table and pulled out a sleek black iPad Pro. I tapped the biometric scanner, the screen unlocked, displaying a live encrypted dashboard from the Geneva syndicate. I slid it across the table. Derek looked at it. The numbers were glowing in crisp, undeniable white text against a dark background. 614 sold 324 1189. His face went completely pale, not the kind of pale that comes from a mild shock, the kind of pale that comes from watching the ground beneath your feet dissolve into an abyss. His breathing stopped. Megan leaned over, her eyes gangsting. She gasped, a raw, ugly sound, her hand flying to her mouth. What is this? Derek choked out, his eyes wide with a terror he could not fully articulate. Where did you get this? I built it, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. While you were playing pretend billionaire with borrowed money, I was quietly multiplying our parents' early tech investments. I am a senior forensic auditor for a federal intelligence task force, Derek. I hunt financial criminals for a living, and you just walked right into my interrogation room. Craig Bellamy scrambled to his feet, his face red. This is irrelevant. The conservatorship order is signed. The judge declared you incompetent based on the evidence. Sit down, Craig, I commanded. I didn't raise my voice, but the absolute crushing weight of the authority in the room forced him back into his chair. Let's talk about your evidence. I reached into the leather messenger bag resting by my feet. I did not rush. I pulled out 3 thick, impeccably organized manila folders, placing them on the table with the precise, deliberate movements of a dealer laying out a winning hand. Let us examine the pillars of your brilliant conservatorship, shall we? I said, tapping the first folder. You claimed I was exhibiting severe cognitive decline. You submitted sworn affidavits stating I was a danger to myself. Megan, you were particularly descriptive about my supposed memory loss at brunch. I slid the first folder toward them. Craig hesitated, then opened it. Inside was the heavily stamped, federal-grade psychological and cognitive evaluation from Dr. Eris Thorne and the independent adjudicator. That, I continued, is a comprehensive, independent psychiatric evaluation conducted yesterday by the chief of psychiatry at a premier federal medical facility. It is co-signed by a state-certified judicial adjudicator. I scored a perfect 30 out of 30 on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. My executive function is flawless. My memory recall is in the 99th percentile. The toxicology report attached to the back proves my system is entirely free of any substances that might induce the symptoms you so creatively described in your affidavits. Craig stared at the signatures, his legal mind frantically calculating the implications. This predates the judge's order. If you had known, I interrupted. My voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, you would not have walked into the trap. That evaluation proves unequivocally that your emergency petition was filed based on fraudulent, fabricated testimony, which brings me to my second point. I pushed the second folder across the table. Megan, I said, turning my gaze to my sister-in-law. She shrank back slightly, her knuckles white as she gripped her designer bag. You have been very busy this year, the casserole visit in January, the charity gala in March. You built a very compelling narrative. Unfortunately for you, narrative is useless against raw data. Derek looked between Megan and the folder. What data? Ellie, what are you talking about? Open it, Derek, I commanded. He reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the cover. Inside were dozens of high-resolution, time-stamped photographs. They were stills pulled from the hidden military-grade micro-cameras installed throughout my cottage. Timestamp: January 14th, 2:14 p.m. Watching Derek's eyes widen as he looked at the first photograph. Megan sets the casserole on the counter. We discuss her personal trainer. I turn away to put the kettle on. Megan reaches out with her left hand and deliberately turns the knob on burner 3. A quarter turn, just enough to release the gas without triggering the ignition. No, Megan gasped, her voice shrill. No, that's manipulated. That's a lie. You were just attempting to manufacture evidence of my incompetence, potentially risking a lethal gas explosion in my home. I corrected smoothly. Turn the page, Derek. He turned the page. The next set of photographs were from the charity gala. The microcamera in my purse had perfectly captured Megan's hand slipping my encrypted phone out of my bag and into her silver clutch. Times March 22nd, 8:15 p.m. I continued. Megan steals my phone while I am in the restroom. 30 minutes later, it miraculously ends up in the lobby fountain, further cementing the illusion of my erratic behavior. I have the high-definition video files backed up on 3 separate secure offshore servers. The local police department will find them extremely compelling when I file criminal charges for reckless endangerment, theft and conspiracy to commit fraud. Derek dropped the folder as if it were burning his fingers. He turned to his wife, his face a mask of shock and rising fury. You turned the gas on? You stole her phone? You told me she was losing her mind, Megan. You told me you were worried about her. I was helping you, she shrieked, dropping the aristocratic facade entirely. Her voice was harsh, desperate. We needed the money, Derek. You said we were going to lose the house. You said the Japanese investors pulled out. I did what I had to do to save our family. You tried to lock your sister-in-law in a psychiatric facility, I observed coldly. Let us not pretend this was an act of noble sacrifice, Megan. You did it because you cannot imagine a life without valet parking and vintage Bordeaux. I turned my attention to the attorney. Craig Bellamy was sweating. A single bead of perspiration rolled down the side of his perfectly contoured face. He was a man who lived by the illusion of control, and he had just realized he was entirely powerless. Mr. Bellamy, I said, tapping the final thickest folder. You are a practitioner of the law. You understand the concept of fiduciary duty. You also understand the federal statutes regarding wire fraud, bank fraud, and the operation of a Ponzi scheme. Craig flinched as if I had struck him physically. I don't know what you are implying, Miss Vance. I am not implying anything. I am stating facts. I spent the last 48 hours dismantling your commercial real estate firm, Saunders Development. I slid the third folder toward him. He did not want to touch it. He stared at it like a condemned man staring at the gallows. Inside that dossier, I said, my voice echoing in the absolute silence of the dining room, is a complete forensic map of your enterprise. It details how you have been taking deposits from new investors for the unbuilt Atlantic Plaza project and illegally diverting those funds to pay the interest on your failing properties in the Seaport District. It documents the network of offshore shell companies you used to artificially inflate property valuations to secure a fraudulent $20 million loan from Regional Northeast Bank. Derek buried his face in his hands, a low guttural moan escaping his throat. I have the ledgers, I continued relentlessly. I have the wire transfer receipts. I have the forged appraisals. You needed $2.5 million by next week to cover the bridge loan, or the entire house of cards collapses. So you decided to cannibalize my assets to save yourselves. Craig's professional composure shattered. He slammed his hands on the table, leaning forward, trying to project intimidation. Listen to me, you little— If you raise your voice to me in my home, Mr. Bellamy, I interrupted, my tone so dangerously quiet it made him freeze, I will ensure that you do not just lose your license to practice law. I will ensure that the Department of Justice makes an example out of you. You will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary where your expensive suits and your country club memberships will mean absolutely nothing." He slowly sank back into his chair, defeated, deflated, a broken man. "You are going to withdraw the conservatorship petition immediately," I instructed, laying out my terms. "You are going to file a motion to dismiss with prejudice, citing a grave administrative error regarding the medical affidavits. You will have my checking account unfrozen before noon today. If you fail to do this, I will forward this dossier to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI White Collar Division, and the State Bar Association by 1 p.m. will do it," Derek whispered, not looking up from his hands. "I'll have Craig file the withdrawal." "Ellie, please, I'm your brother." I was desperate. "I didn't know what else to do." "You knew exactly what to do, Derek," I replied, feeling no pity for the pathetic man sitting across from me. "You chose to prey on the person you believed was the weakest target in your proximity. That was your only miscalculation. You assumed my silence was a symptom of weakness. You never stopped to consider that it was the discipline of a predator waiting for you to step into the light." I stood up from the table. I smoothed the non-existent wrinkles from my sweater. "There is one more thing," I said, looking down at them. "You have a very important dinner tonight at Lucia's. A private dining room, 8 p.m. You are hosting Howard Prescott, the head of Prescott Capital." Derek's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a new distinct flavor of terror. How do you know about Howard?" "I know everything, Derek. I know you are hoping Howard Prescott will inject $5 million in emergency equity into your firm, completely unaware of your fraudulent accounting. I know you booked the Tuscany room, and I know that I will be joining you for dinner." Megan stood up, panic rendering her practically breathless. "No, you can't. If you come, you'll ruin it. Howard is a traditionalist. He expects a stable family dynamic. If you start talking about forensic audits and offshore trusts, he will walk away. Then you had better hope I find the appetizer selection sufficiently engaging." I smiled. A cold, empty expression. "I suggest you go home, change into your finest evening wear, and prepare to be excellent hosts. Because tonight, Derek, you are going to introduce me to Mr. Prescott, and you are going to pray that I decide to be the quiet, unassuming little sister you always wanted me to be." I gestured toward the front door. "Now, get out of my house." They left. They stumbled out the door like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to whatever shreds of dignity they had left. Craig Bellamy practically sprinted to his car, dialing his phone frantically before the engine even started. Derek and Megan walked in silence, a vast unbridgeable chasm having opened between them. I watched from the window as Derek's luxury SUV pulled out of my driveway, the illusion of their perfect life permanently fractured. The rest of the day was an exercise in absolute calm. At exactly 11:45 a.m. my phone buzzed, a notification from my secondary bank account. The freeze had been lifted. Craig had filed the withdrawal, moving with the terrifying speed of a man trying to outrun a federal indictment. I spent the afternoon gardening. I pruned my hydrangeas. I felt the warm Virginia sun on my shoulders, breathed in the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. The air felt cleaner, lighter. I was not just dismantling their empire, I was reclaiming my own space. For years I had tolerated their condescension, their subtle insults, their belief that my life was small and insignificant because it was not loud. They confused volume with value, they confused visibility with power. At 5 p.m. I went inside to prepare for dinner. I did not wear a simple black dress, I did not wear the quiet, unassuming clothes of little Ellie. I walked into my walk-in closet and bypassed the sensible cardigans. Instead I pulled out a bespoke tailored suit from Savile Row, deep, rich charcoal wool with subtle pinstripes, cut to absolute perfection. It was the armor I wore when I walked into the boardrooms of international banks to deliver devastating news. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and a vintage Cartier watch I had purchased at auction in Geneva, a subtle, undeniable marker of extreme wealth that only someone of Howard Prescott's caliber would recognize. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe chignon. I applied a deep, blood-red lipstick. The woman staring back at me in the mirror was not a scapegoat. She was an executioner. At 7:30 p.m. I called an executive black car service. I could have driven my sedan, but tonight was about establishing dominance through every available metric. Lucia's was the kind of restaurant where the lighting was aggressively dim, the wine list was heavier than a telephone directory, and the waiters moved with the silent, choreographed grace of ballet dancers. It was a fortress of old money and corporate deals. When I arrived, the maitre bowed slightly. "Good evening, madam. Do you have a reservation?" "I am joining the Saunders party," I said smoothly. "The Tuscany room? Yes, right this way." He led me through the hushed main dining area, past the velvet curtains and pushed open the heavy oak door to the private room. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension, a fragile glass bridge suspended over a canyon. Derek sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a fresh suit, though his collar seemed a fraction too tight. Megan sat to his right, her smile rigidly fixed, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. Craig Bellamy and his wife were there, Craig looking slightly nauseous despite the expensive scotch in his hand. And at the far end of the table sat Howard Prescott and his wife Diane. Howard was a man in his late 60s, possessing the sharp, evaluating eyes of a predator who had survived decades in the corporate jungle. He wore a navy blazer that radiated quiet generational wealth. The conversation stalled the moment I walked in. Derek stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He looked at my charcoal suit, the Cartier watch, the dark red lipstick. He realized with a sinking horror that the quiet sister had not arrived. The senior forensic auditor had arrived, Eleanor, Derek said, his voice straining to maintain a casual, welcoming tone. You made it. We are so glad. I walked to the only empty chair at the table, directly across from Megan. I did not sit immediately. I looked at Howard Prescott and offered a polite, measured smile. Derek, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. Aren't you going to introduce me? Of course, Derek swallowed hard. Howard, Diane, this is my younger sister Eleanor. Ellie, this is Howard Prescott, the CEO of Prescott Capital. It is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Prescott, I said, extending my hand. My grip was firm. Confident, Howard looked at me with genuine curiosity. He had clearly been briefed on the narrative of the unstable, quiet sister. The woman standing before him radiating cold, unyielding power did not fit that narrative. He noticed the watch, his eyes flickered with a sudden sharpened interest. The pleasure is mine, Eleanor, Howard said, leaning back in his chair as I took my seat. Derek has mentioned you, though I must admit, the picture he painted seems incomplete. Megan let out a high-pitched, nervous giggle. Oh, Ellie just loves to surprise us. She has a little bookkeeping job, she spends most of her time in her cottage. Bookkeeping, Howard repeated, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He looked directly at me. Is that right? You manage ledgers for local businesses? I picked up the linen napkin, unfolded it with precise, deliberate movements and placed it across my lap. I looked at Derek. He was silently pleading with me, his eyes wide, begging me to play along, begging me not to pull the pin on the grenade. I smiled. Not exactly, Mr. Prescott, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated. I am a senior forensic auditor for a specialized federal intelligence task force. My expertise lies in dismantling international money laundering operations, untangling offshore shell corporations, and identifying sophisticated large-scale financial fraud. The silence in the Tuscany room was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum, of all oxygen being instantly removed. Craig Bellamy dropped his heavy crystal scotch glass. It hit the mahogany table with a loud thud, splashing amber liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. He didn't even notice. Megan's jaw literally dropped. She stared at me as if I had just peeled off my skin to reveal a mechanical endoskeleton. Derek stopped breathing, the color drained from his face so rapidly I briefly wondered if he was going to experience a cardiac event. Howard Prescott, however, did not panic. A slow, deeply fascinated smile spread across his weathered face. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, completely ignoring Derek. Forensic auditing, Howard murmured, his eyes locked onto mine. Now, that is a highly specialized field. You hunt the ghosts in the machine, precisely. I replied, taking a sip from my water glass. I find the money that people believe they have successfully hidden. I find the lies buried beneath the projections fascinating, Diane chimed in, equally captivated. It must be incredibly dangerous work, dealing with such desperate people. Desperate people make predictable mistakes. Diane, I said smoothly, my eyes briefly flicking toward Derek and Craig. They become arrogant. They assume that because they control the narrative in the room, they control the reality of the ledger. They leverage properties they don't own to secure loans they can't afford. They build their empires on toxic debt and pray that a new investor will arrive to cover the shortfall before the federal regulators notice. Howard's smile slowly faded. He was a billionaire because he was exceptionally good at reading subtext. He looked at me, then looked at Derek, whose face was now a pale, sweaty mask of sheer terror. Howard looked at the spilled scotch on Craig Bellamy's placemat. The pieces clicked together in Howard's mind with the speed of a steel trap. Eleanor, Howard said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the conversational warmth and adopting a chilling, corporate edge. That is an oddly specific example. It is a common pattern in commercial real estate fraud. Mr. Prescott, I replied calmly. Often the perpetrators will use LLCs to artificially inflate appraisals. They will use deposits from unbuilt projects to cover bridge loans on failing ones. It is a classic Ponzi structure. It requires an infusion of external capital, say $5 million in emergency equity, to sustain the illusion of solvency. Derek slammed his hands on the table, standing up so violently his chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor. Howard, don't listen to her. She's having an episode. I told you she was unstable. She's making this up. Howard did not even look at Derek. He kept his eyes fixed entirely on me. Are you having an episode, Eleanor? Howard asked quietly. I have a federal-grade psychological evaluation completed yesterday proving my cognitive function is flawless. Mr. Prescott, I replied without missing a beat. I also have a 54-page dossier detailing the exact fraudulent transactions, forged appraisals, and illegal wire transfers of Saunders Development over the past 36 months. I would be happy to forward the encrypted file to your compliance team. I believe it will save you $5 million. Megan burst into tears, burying her face in her hands. It was not a calculated, manipulative cry. It was the raw, ugly weeping of a woman who has just watched her entire aristocratic identity burn to ash. Craig Bellamy slowly stood up. He did not look at anyone. He pulled his wallet from his pocket, threw a $100 bill onto the table to cover his spilled drink, and walked out of the private dining room without saying a single word. He knew it was over. He was walking directly to his car to call a criminal defense attorney. Howard Prescott remained seated for a long moment. He looked at Derek, who was standing paralyzed, his hands shaking uncontrollably, his breathing ragged and shallow. Derek, Howard said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. You invited me here tonight to ask for my money. You sat at my table, drank my wine, and attempted to involve my firm in a federal crime. Howard, I can explain, Derek pleaded, his voice cracking. It's a temporary cash flow issue. The projections are solid. You need a lawyer, Howard interrupted, standing up. He buttoned his navy blazer with slow, deliberate precision. He turned to his wife, Diane. I believe we are finished here. Howard looked at me one last time. He offered a brief, respectful nod in acknowledgement between predators. Eleanor, it was a genuine pleasure meeting you. Your firm is very lucky to have you. Thank you, Mr. Prescott. Have a safe drive home. Howard and Diane walked out of the room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind them. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was not the tense silence of anticipation. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a graveyard. Derek collapsed into his chair. He stared blankly at the mahogany table, his ambition, his pride, and his entire future lying in invisible ruins across the white linen. Megan continued to sob quietly into her hands, the illusion of her superiority shattered beyond repair. I finished my glass of water. I carefully picked up my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside my plate. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. You thought I was weak because I was quiet, I said, my voice carrying the cold final weight of a judge reading a sentence. You thought my silence was permission for you to exploit me. You tried to steal my freedom to cover your failures. Derek looked up at me, his eyes were red, utterly broken. Ellie, what are we going to do? You are going to wait for the FBI to knock on your door, Derek. And I am going to go home. I picked up my leather clutch. I did not offer a comforting touch. I did not offer a word of forgiveness. Forgiveness is for those who make mistakes. They had made a calculated choice. I turned my back on my brother and his weeping wife. I walked out of the Tuscany room, my heels clicking a sharp rhythmic cadence against the hardwood floor. I did not look back. I walked through the opulent restaurant, out the front doors and into the cool, crisp evening air. The black car was waiting for me. I slid into the leather back seat, the door closing with a solid, I find. Where to, Miss Vance? The driver asked. Home, please, I said, leaning back against the comfortable leather. As the car pulled away from the curb, I looked out the window at the city lights blurring past. I thought about the $600 million sitting quietly in Geneva. I thought about the dossier that would land on the SEC director's desk in the morning. And I thought about the absolute intoxicating power of silence. Let them think you are small. Let them think you are weak. Let them weave their webs and build their traps. The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest one. The most dangerous person is the one who watches, waits, and holds all the data. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever been the quiet one holding the match while they poured the gasoline, share this video, drop a like, and remember, never apologize for your success and never ever warn them before you strike. Stay silent, stay deadly, and keep building your empire. The story of my family's spectacular implosion did not end in the hushed, velvet-lined private dining room of Lucia's. In many ways, the dinner was merely the overture. The true symphony of their destruction was performed the following morning, illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of federal jurisdiction. At 7 a.m., while Derek was likely staring at the ceiling of his heavily mortgaged mansion, paralyzed by the impending doom I had promised him, I walked into the high-security lobby of my federal office building in Washington, D.C. I swiped my biometric badge. The heavy glass doors parted seamlessly. I took the elevator to the secure floor, a labyrinth of glass-walled offices and digital war rooms where financial ghosts are hunted and captured. My team was already assembled in Conference Room B. There were 6 of them, brilliant, caffeinated, and armed with the kind of clearance that made Wall Street executives break out in cold sweats. I placed the 54-page dossier on the center of the frosted glass table. "Good morning," I said, pulling up the digital projection of the Saunders Development organizational chart. "Today we are dismantling a localized Ponzi scheme operating under the guise of commercial real estate development in Boston. The primary targets are Derek Saunders, CEO, and Craig Bellamy, Principal Legal Counsel. The fraud is currently estimated at $42 million, heavily reliant on forged property appraisals and illegal diversions of bridge loan capital." Agent Miller, my lead data analyst, flipped through the physical dossier. He let out a low whistle. "This is incredibly thorough, Eleanor. You've mapped every shell LLC, you even have the IP addresses of the offshore servers they used to falsify the wire transfers. We usually spend 6 months building a case like this." "I had a personal interest in expediting the process," I replied smoothly, a faint, razor-sharp smile touching my lips. "I want the Securities and Exchange Commission looped in immediately. I want the FBI white-collar division ready to move. We freeze their corporate accounts by 9 a.m., we execute search warrants on the Saunders Development corporate offices by 10 a.m., and I want federal holds placed on both of their passports before they finish their morning coffee." By 9:15 a.m., Derek Saunders attempted to log into his corporate banking portal to execute a frantic, desperate wire transfer to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He was met with a stark, terrifying red banner across his screen: "Access pending federal investigation." By 10:15 a.m., a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the sleek glass-fronted headquarters of Saunders Development in downtown Boston. Dozens of federal agents wearing blue windbreakers poured into the lobby. They did not ask for permission. They bypassed the receptionist, marched into the executive suites, and began seizing hard drives, physical ledgers, and encrypted servers. Derek was not in his office. When the agents breached his suite, they found his mahogany desk covered in shredded documents, a pathetic, amateurish attempt to destroy evidence that I already had backed up on a secure federal mainframe. Derek had panicked. Instead of facing the music, he had driven to Logan International Airport. He had booked a first-class, one-way ticket to a small island nation that notoriously lacked a formal extradition treaty with the United States. He was sitting in the VIP lounge, sipping a glass of complimentary champagne, believing he had successfully escaped the inferno. He was wrong. At 11:30 a.m., 2 federal marshals approached him in the lounge. They did not read him his rights quietly. They placed him in handcuffs in front of a dozen other affluent travelers, the metal clicking loudly against his custom-tailored suit. His champagne glass shattered on the floor. Craig Bellamy, ever the calculating attorney, took a different approach. When he saw the news of the raid breaking on the local financial networks, he immediately drove to the federal prosecutor's office. He walked in, demanding full immunity in exchange for turning state's evidence against Derek. He intended to paint my brother as the criminal mastermind, claiming he was merely a naive legal advisor who had been duped. The prosecutor, who was already reviewing my comprehensive dossier, let Craig speak for 20 uninterrupted minutes. When Craig finished his desperate, sweaty monologue, the prosecutor simply slid a photograph across the table. It was a digital copy of an email Craig had sent 3 years ago, explicitly instructing Derek on how to structure a fraudulent LLC to hide illegal capital gains. "Mr. Bellamy," the prosecutor said coldly, "we do not offer immunity to the architect of the fraud. Put your hands on the table." 2 weeks later, the preliminary bail hearing was held at the federal courthouse. I attended. I did not wear the charcoal suit of an executioner. I wore a simple, elegant trench coat over a high-neck sweater. I sat in the back row of the gallery, completely still, observing the wreckage. Derek and Craig were brought into the courtroom wearing orange jumpsuits, their wrists shackled to their waists. The transformation was startling. Derek's perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. The arrogant, condescending posture that had defined his entire existence had completely evaporated. He looked small, he looked utterly terrified. Megan was seated in the front row, the luxury she had clung to so desperately had already been stripped away. Their mansion was in foreclosure, the leased cars had been repossessed. She was wearing a plain, unremarkable coat, her face pale and drawn, entirely devoid of the smug superiority she used to wield like a weapon. The judge denied bail for both men, citing extreme flight risk, a designation heavily supported by Derek's airport stunt. As the marshals prepared to lead them back to the holding cells, Derek turned and scanned the gallery. His eyes found mine for a brief suspended moment. The courtroom fell away. He looked at the quiet, unassertive younger sister he had spent a lifetime underestimating. He looked at the woman he had tried to lock in a psychiatric facility to steal her home. I did not smile, I did not gloat, I simply looked back at him with the cold, absolute indifference one reserves for a stranger. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom before he even broke eye contact. In the hallway I felt a timid tug on my sleeve. I turned to see Rosie, my 19-year-old niece. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying, caught in the devastating crossfire of her parents' greed. "Aunt Ellie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's over, they lost everything. Mom says we have to move into a tiny apartment. I don't know how I'm going to pay for my tuition at MIT." I looked at the brilliant young woman who had risked everything to warn me on that rainy Tuesday. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick sealed envelope. I handed it to her. "What is this?" she asked, looking at the heavy parchment. "It is the documentation for a secure, blind trust I established in your name yesterday," I said softly, my voice devoid of the coldness I reserved for her father. "It contains more than enough capital to cover your tuition, your living expenses, and a substantial foundation for your future endeavors in cybersecurity. Your parents cannot touch it, no creditor can seize it." Rosie stared at the envelope, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "Aunt Ellie, why, after everything they did to you?" "Because you are not them, Rosie," I replied, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You chose integrity over loyalty to a corrupt system. You proved that you have the moral clarity to build something real. Go back to school, finish your degree, build your own empire, and never let anyone tell you that you are required to sink with a ship you did not steer." She hugged me, a tight, desperate embrace. I held her for a moment, letting her cry. Before stepping back, I gave her a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she whispered. I turned and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the courthouse. I stepped out into the crisp, bright morning air of Washington, D.C. The city was bustling, indifferent to the monumental shift that had just occurred in my life. I hailed a cab, giving the driver the address to my office. I had a 1 p.m. briefing on a cartel money laundering operation in Eastern Europe, and I did not intend to be late. If there is one absolute truth I have learned from dismantling fraudulent empires, it is this: power does not need to announce itself. The loudest person in the room is usually the most fragile. They rely on noise to distract from their lack of substance. But true power, the kind of power that alters destinies and shatters illusions, is built in the dark. It is built through patience, through meticulous documentation, and through an unshakable belief in your own intrinsic value. To every woman watching this, if you are currently the scapegoat, the underestimated sister, the wife whose intelligence is dismissed, or the daughter treated like an afterthought, do not argue with them. Do not waste your energy trying to convince a predator that you are strong. Let them mock you, let them boast, let them build their houses of cards while you silently, methodically build your fortress. Gather your evidence, secure your independence, multiply your resources in the shadows, and when they finally push too far, when they finally attempt to cross the line and take the last piece of dignity you possess, do not scream. Simply smile, lay your cards on the table, and watch their entire world collapse under the devastating weight of the truth. This has been Eleanor Vance for Alpha Empower Stories. If you survived the fire and built your own empire from the ashes, leave a comment below. Share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded of their own silent strength. And please hit that subscribe button. The world needs to hear more stories about the dragons who refuse to stay asleep. Until next time, stay sharp, stay quiet, and never ever lose your edge. Thank you so much for tuning in to Alpha Empower Stories. If you found value in this journey of delayed justice and absolute empowerment, please consider leaving a comment, sharing the video with the strong women in your own life, and subscribing for more content. Remember, the quiet ones are the ones who change the rules of the game. Never let them see you coming, and never apologize for the strength you built in the dark.